Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Women's Diaries Voice, we retell those moments honest every day, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. My name is Lena Marlowe, and I was 25 the morning I stood at the edge of a granite grave in St. Peter's Cemetery, watching two glossy sedans slide to the curb like black seals in the rain. My parents stepped out in coordinated mourning. My mother's veil a shade darker than her coat. My father's cufflinks catching the gray light. People who could arrange a scene the way other people arranged flowers. 10 years earlier, they had called me a financial burden and told me to pack a bag. That sentence had split my life into before and after. It still rang in my ears as the priest began. The man in the cedar casket was Elliot Reed. My grandfather on my father's side, though grandfather never captured the accurate scale of what he was to me. He had a way of making a silence feel like shelter. The first shovel of soil hit the lid with a softened thud, and the sound moved through my ribs. Across the lane, my mother adjusted her veil and put on a sorrowful expression the way she might put on a brooch. My father shook hands, murmuring platitudes in a voice he used for business calls. I kept my eyes on the simple photograph propped against the casket Elliot on the dock at Stillwater Lake, a wool cap pulled low, the water lying as flat as hammered pewter behind him. I did not cry there. I had done that through the night at the little table by the window of my apartment in Providence, remembering his hands square, capable nicked from tools always warm. The priest finished, the umbrellas folded, people drifted toward their cars. I stayed a moment longer, palm on smooth cedar, then walked out under a sky the color of cold tin. I grew up in a neighborhood that looked orderly in real estate flyers, green shutters, trimmed hedges, flagstones set in measured steps. Inside our house, order was a kind of religion. Elaine, my mother, could iron an apology flat. She had a gift for orchestrating impressions, rotating throw pillows with the season rehearsing small talk before fundraisers, straightening my collar at the door. Not those boots, Lena, she would say. The Mercers noticed things. Victor. My father liked schedules, trophies, and invoices paid on time. If I brought home a perfect report card, he nodded without glancing up from the Providence Journal. If my younger brother Caleb scored the winning point at Saturday basketball, there were burgers on the grill and stories retold to the point of myth. The exception to all that staging was Elliot's cabin an hour north, a place that refused to pretend to be anything other than what it was. The cabin sat back from Stillwater Lake on a little rise shouldered by pines. The porch boards sang when you stepped on them. A green Ford with a dented fender leaned in the weeds by the shed. Inside, the air smelled like sap and coffee and old wool. He made things last, reglazing windows, sharpening knives, mending a net until the mends were their own pattern. Use what you have, fix what you can, he'd say, setting a screw with the calm of someone who understood how wood wants to be. He taught me 100 small competencies that made the world feel friendly instead of sharp. How to read a sky, how to tell good rope from bad, by the way it held a knot, how to listen for the hollow note in a board that meant rot. On the dock, he showed me how to slip a fish back into the water without scraping off its armor of scales. Money, he said once as we counted perch more out of habit than need, isn't a halo or a stain. It's a lever. Put it under the right place and you can lift something that matters. He said it with a shrug, as if the idea were as practical as knowing which wrench to reach for. At home, that sentence would have sounded like heresy. My parents measured money by what it could be seen doing, how it behaved at the country club, whether it could be tasted, driven, worn. When I was 14, Elliot surprised me with an easel he'd found secondhand and sanded smooth a little drawer of oils arranged by hue. So you can stop chasing paper with a pencil and let color do the talking, he said, as if it were nothing, as if this wasn't the most attentive gift I'd ever received. I painted the lake in winter, the pale grass at its edge like a crew cut. Elliot's hands in close study, the crooked knuckle from a long-ago break, the crescent of earth that never left the half-moons of his nails. If the cabin was oxygen, home was glass. The more I painted, the more I felt the press of it. One evening, I heard my parents talking in the kitchen, their voices low and precise, the way they got when they were counting something. "Your father's comfortable," my mother said. meaning Elliot. Comfortable in her mouth, always reached for a larger number. "We should be thoughtful," she added. "Lena spends a lot of time up there." My father made a thoughtful sound, the sound he made when he was negotiating. My name slid across the counter tile between them like a playing piece. I didn't understand the full weight of that conversation until the day I discovered what Elliot kept quiet. It was late summer. He'd asked me to bring down a bundle of old charts from the loft above the mudroom. I climbed the narrow stair and ducked into the scent of dust and twine. In the half-light, my shoulder clipped a crate. A small metal box slid out, stuttered at the stair lip, and burst open when it struck the landing. Bills and receipts scattered, and a ledger the color of tea flopped open, its spine cracking like a yawn. I reached for it and saw my name not written, but printed in the tidy column of notes beside a line item. Harbor House Youth Arts Day. Lena assisted. The pages were neat dates, modest sums, plain descriptions, bus passes, clinic vouchers, school uniforms, a line here and there for Seed Grant Copley Street grocer. Some entries had a star and the initials NSF. I took the ledger down to the kitchen like contraband. Elliot was kneeling by the stove with a screwdriver, coaxing the door to close without jamming. He glanced up, saw the book, and sat back on his heels. "I was looking for maps," I said. "I know," he said. He wiped his hands on a rag and reached for the ledger. For a long moment, he didn't open it. Then he pushed it back to me. "You may as well know if you've already seen it." "What's NSF?" "North Star Fund," he said. "Just a name I made up when the bank wanted something to call the account." "You're running a fund." "Not running. Helping," he said, quietly. "Cheaper to get a new tire than to miss a week of work. Cheaper to get a kid a flute than to let him quit band because the rental's overdue." It started small. It stayed small on purpose. "Why not put your name on it?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. I had grown up around brass plaques and donor walls. Names were how adults kept score. He smiled at that. "Because the names that matter are on the forms no one frames," he said. "And because your father enjoys his name on things more than is strictly good for him." I promised I would keep it between us. He didn't make me promise. He simply nodded as if he had expected me to say so. Knowing changed the way I saw my parents. Their preoccupation, which I had taken as a quirk of taste, resolved into ambition that had the shape of an appetite, and it clarified what I wanted. I began to build a portfolio and secret portraits of neighbors, studies of light-off puddles, the warped reflection of a steeple in a shop window. I researched schools I hadn't dared say aloud: Baxter School of Art, Harrington College programs that awarded scholarships if you could convince a jury you saw something worth bringing back. I should have hidden the application better. Elaine was tidying my room the way a customs agent inspects luggage. She found the leather folder under my bed, the sketches, the recommendation from my art teacher. The printed page where a scholarship coordinator had written that my preliminary portfolio shows rare control of negative space. She stood in my doorway with the folder like a citation. Art school. Her voice sounded like she had bitten into something sour and was determined to finish it anyway. "You will not gallop off into poverty with a paintbrush." "It's not galloping," I said. "It's a plan. We have invested in you," my father said, appearing in the hall like he'd been waiting just out of frame. "We expect you to invest in yourself responsibly." "Like Caleb's travel teams?" I asked before I could stop the words. "Like the private coach, the new shoes every season." The slap arrived before the rest of the sentence did. It wasn't theatrical. It was small and fast and precise, like the correction of a line. My cheek went hot. The folder slipped from my hands. Drawings sledded across the hardwood. "You will not speak to your mother like that," Victor said, even though it had been her hand, not mine. He picked up a sketch, folded it, and set it on my desk. "You have a choice, Lena. Finish the year, apply to real schools, study something with a future. Or you can take your little hobby and what I said." The calm in my voice surprised me. "And you can find somewhere else that appreciates it." I remember the way the light moved across my carpet in a slow square. I remember the story my body tried to tell me back down. And apologize, make it stop. I remember choosing not to tell that story. I collected what I could carry. 2 changes of clothes, the pencil roll Elliot had made from canvas and twine, a toothbrush. The acceptance letter from Baxter's summer program that I had not yet had the nerve to say aloud. The rain had begun while we argued. By the time I stepped onto the front stoop, it was coming down in sheets that blurred the porch light. I had $28 in my pocket and my bus pass. I sat on the bench 3 blocks away and listened to the rain talk to the roofs and the gutters and the asphalt. I tried to calculate the distance to the Baxter dorms to the houses of the few friends whose parents liked my parents enough to call them first. The numbers didn't help. The rain soaked the edge of my sweatshirt and pulled it heavy against my skin. I didn't call Elliot. I didn't want to turn his name into a flare. He found me anyway. Later he would tell me he'd phoned the house, and Elaine had said brightly that I was at a friend's. Which friend, he'd asked. You know how teenagers are. She'd said the way people say a thing when they want the conversation to end. He'd put on his coat. His truck sounded like itself before it arrived, the particular rattle of a heat shield he always meant to tighten. He pulled to the curb, leaned across the bench seat, and pushed open the passenger door. "Get in, kiddo," he said. His voice was steady, but something tight had entered it, a wire drawn. I slid into the warmth water pooling on the rubber mat under my heels. He handed me a towel that smelled like laundry line and pine. "Did you bring enough?" he asked, glancing at my backpack. "For tonight," I said. "That'll do," he said, and put the truck in gear. We drove out of the city in a cone of headlights, the wipers thudding their metronome. By the time we turned down the narrow road to Stillwater, the rain had gentled to a whisper on the windshield. Elliot left the truck idling while he unlocked the door. The cabin exhaled its familiar breath, cedar coffee wool. He clicked on the lamp by the sofa. The light found the old maps on the wall and the dent on the corner of the coffee table where I dropped a jar of linseed oil when I was 12. "The guest room's made up," he said. "Sheets are clean. There's a sweater in the top drawer that will fit you. We'll sort out the rest when the sun's up." I stood in the doorway of the little room at the back, the one with the window that faced the lake through 2 pines and a stretch of wild blueberry. The quilt was the blue of old denim. A moth turned slow circles in the lampshade. I set my backpack on the chair and placed my pencil roll on the desk Elliot had sanded smooth years ago. The house settled, wood answering, wood rain ticking on the sill. I sat on the edge of the bed, palms open on my knees, and felt the weight of the day slough off in pieces, leaving a quiet that wasn't empty. In the narrow closet, a sweater waited. On the other side of the wall, the lake breathed against the shore. I reached up and pulled the chain on the lamp. The room went to hush and shadow, steady as a held note. Outside, somewhere in the trees, an owl called once and fell silent. By morning, the rain had rinsed the world clean. I woke to the sound of the lake combing the stones and the kettle beginning to chatter on the stove. Elliot moved about the kitchen in his wool socks, humming a tune he never finished, setting out 2 mugs, a jar of honey, and a plate of toast that tasted faintly of smoke. The room held its usual weather cedar coffee, a whisper of laundry soap from the line. I sat at the table with a pencil drawing the way the steam lifted off his cup and braided itself into the colder air. He glanced at the page once and smiled without moving his mouth. We did not discuss the word forever. We talked instead about what needed doing before noon. He showed me how the back door stuck because the frame swelled in weather like this, how to sand the edge without losing the square. We made a list, pick up nails, check the pump call. Ms. Klein, an attorney in town, Elliot trusted. I didn't ask why we needed a lawyer. He didn't tell me. It was not a secret, just a piece of timing. 2 weeks later, I sat on a wooden bench outside family court, knees pressed together, hearing my name called through a speaker. The judge's robe looked like a heavy coat. Ms. Klein spoke in a stream that felt both warm and structured: school records, the incident in my parents' hallway, the impossibility of sending me back to a house that had locked itself against me. Elaine and Victor were there, both in their best neutral faces, both furious behind the glass. They did not look at me. Ms. Klein asked one last question in a soft voice, something about safety, and I said yes here, and gestured almost without thinking as if the cabin were a person sitting beside me. Guardianship was granted. The clerk stamped a paper with a noise that sounded like a period. Elliot did not celebrate. He made soup and told me to put my feet up because stockings were an unreasonable invention. That first month was a series of new shapes finding their proper places. My sketchbooks on the shelf above the desk in the small back room, my toothbrush in a mug with a chip, my coat beside his on the peg. On Saturday mornings, we drove into town early when the bakery had more bread than customers and talked with people who knew Elliot in the particular way that comes from 100 small favors and no announcements. He never introduced me as anything grander than my granddaughter Lana. It didn't feel small. In late September, I auditioned for Riverside Arts Charter, a public school 2 towns over that accepted students on portfolio and promise. A social worker had suggested it after seeing my sketches spread across Miss Klein's desk. Elliot drove me in the green Ford, with the unreliable heater, the portfolio case on my knees. In the lobby, students with dyed hair and paint-splattered sneakers moved around in a quiet choreography, giving one another room to imagine. In a classroom that smelled faintly of turpentine and orange peels, a woman named Ms. Carty turned pages of my work as if each were a creature that might spook if touched too quickly. She asked questions I had never heard adults ask me. Why did I leave so much space around the subject? What did I see when light fell through glass? Where did I want the viewer to rest? I answered as best I could. Elliot waited in the truck with the paper, the driver's door open to the last warm afternoon. When the acceptance letter came in October, printed on stock so smooth, it felt like a boast. Elliot set it on the table, smoothed the corners with his palm, and then without ceremony stood up and said, "Where's my coat? We're late." He drove me to the hardware store and bought a small brass hook. We screwed it into the wall by my desk and hung the letter so it would swing a little when the window was open. "Some things are meant to be looked at often," he said. I spoke into his sweater. "Thank you," and he pretended not to hear the tremor. School remade the week. The mornings began before light. Elliot brewed coffee that could stand a spoon upright and packed 2 apples and a wedge of cheddar in a paper bag. The truck grumbled onto the road while the lake still held the last of the night on its back. We learned the radio stations that played classical before dawn, the curve in the road where deer liked to test their luck, the exact rhythm of the traffic light by the mill that would let you through if you didn't rush it. He dropped me at the curb and said the same way every day. Make a mess worth making. I learned to stretch canvas to build a palette that didn't fight itself to see the color inside what looked like shadow. I learned how to tell a story without putting any people in it. In English, I wrote about the sound of rain inside a hood, and in math, I developed a grudging respect for the clean honesty of lines that never touched. I ate lunch with a girl named Mara, who constructed tiny sculptures out of wire and used tea bags. She taught me how to solder a joint that wouldn't weep. The school required service hours, and Ms. Carty quietly rerouted mine to places Elliot already knew. On Tuesday afternoons, I swept the floor at Harbor House, which sheltered women and children between one life and another. On Thursdays, I sorted donated jackets at the church on Maple, matching zippers to sizes, tags to arms. Names came into my hands with the coats L. Jackson in Sharpie on a lining, KS on a sweatshirt tag. I added sizes and needs to the ledger tucked into my bag, the same careful shorthand Elliot used, JKT 5T2, bus pass math tutor. M. Alvarez, new. Work, boots, C. Ortiz. North Star Fund stopped being a mysterious set of initials and became an itinerary. Elliot rarely appeared in the entryways of the places we visited. He preferred to wait in the truck while I collected the texture of what was needed and brought it back to him in the form of notes and receipts. What did the room feel like, he'd ask, and if I said tired but hopeful, he'd nod as if that were a number he could add to his sums. He pressed me to notice details that didn't fit in boxes' banisters at the shelter smooth with hands. A child folding a napkin precisely the way an older person had shown them, and to track them anyway because they told the real story. I was not an apprentice in any official way, but the ledger began to carry my handwriting next to his. At-home life arranged itself around edges. I learned to cook his favorites, from the handwritten cards in the tin on the shelf cod cakes with too much parsley, because I didn't yet trust the ocean to speak for itself, a stew that always tasted better the second night. I sanded and stained the desk in my room until it felt like a calm surface, not just a piece of furniture. On good Saturdays, we drove to the flea market, where people sold old tools like puzzles from another era. Elliot taught me to test whether a plain sole was truly flat by setting it on the table and trying to slide a single hair under it. He talked me through changing the oil in the truck, watching my hands with approval that arrived as silence rather than applause. Elaine called once a week for a while. The first time I answered, she asked me to apologize for embarrassing the family as if the season had been marred by weather I could control. She did not inquire about school. She inquired about Elliot, whether he was managing, whether he was keeping up, whether I had noticed any confusion. I said he was fine. She told me Mrs. Mercer had admired her shoes at the fundraiser, as if this piece of public record might serve as proof of our continued proximity to good taste. After that, when the phone rang and the caller ID showed our old number, I let it purr itself quiet. Caleb stayed a postcard news without texture delivered by Elliot, who gleaned it in polite conversations with my father's friends at the diner. Point guard, then captain. A sprain, then a scholarship possibility. He's a good kid, Elliot said, and he didn't need to say the rest. The kids can be trained to face any direction. The winter I turned 16, the lake froze in a skin so clear you could see trapped bubbles like punctuation marks. Elliot's hand sometimes shook when he reached for the kettle. He claimed it was the cold. I began taking on more of the errands without comment. When the wind slammed the corner of the cabin at night, he woke and then fell back to sleep immediately. I did not. In spring, Riverside held its student show. I hung 2 small canvases and 1 large piece that looked at Stillwater without giving away its exact geography. At the opening, Elliot stood in front of the big one for so long that my teacher thought he was lost and asked if he needed help. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm exactly where I meant to be. For once I didn't mind being seen." After he steered me into an Italian place with checkered tablecloths and ordered the meal as if he ate out every week, which he did not. We shared a lemon tart that tasted like sun grown carefully in a small garden. By senior year, I had a portfolio that felt like a hand I could trust. Applications went out to schools whose brochures featured tall windows and big tables Baxter Harrington, and one I sent to New York on a dare I made with myself, the Sable Institute of Art. Elliot insisted I read the financial aid pages as closely as the program descriptions. "What you love shouldn't have to pay twice," he said. I said, "You're mixing metaphors," and he said, "You're welcome." Sable's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain. A scholarship big enough to make the impossible look merely difficult. Elliot didn't suggest a celebration. He put gas in the truck and drove the long way home past the ridge where you could see the river make its serious turn. "Pick a place," he said. I pointed to an overlook that wasn't really an overlook, just a gap in the trees where the land admitted it was on a slope. We stood there without talking, 2 people with a problem they were glad to have. New York was loud. It scampered and shouted and lay down on the sidewalk in a tantrum, then got up and kissed you on both cheeks. I rented a room in a building that smelled like onions and violin practice, learned the subway with my finger on the map, and came home to Stillwater on weekends I could afford in time and money. I called Elliot every other day, sometimes from the studio with paint on my wrist, sometimes from a bodega with too much light. He did not ask for grades. He asked what had surprised me. In February of my 2nd year, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Lena," my mother said, as if tasting the name for the first time in years. Her tone had the softness of new towels. She said she and my father had been thinking. She said they had misread who I was. She said family was important. It was a string of words from a catalog of reconciliation, and if I'd heard it alone, I might have placed an order. The next day, Elliot called and said he had a doctor's appointment he hadn't told me about. Nothing dramatic, he said, and then cleared his throat in a way that changed the shape of the kitchen in my mind. Early-stage prostate cancer, treatable. He told me to stay in New York and finish the term. I bought a train ticket for Friday without telling him. I arrived at the cabin in the blue hour before dark. On the table sat a baking dish with an earnest note in my mother's handwriting. Spinach lasagna heart under the signature. Victor's cufflinks glittered dully in a small dish, forgotten or planted, I couldn't tell which. Their coats hung on the back of chairs, as if they might be back from the car any minute. Elliot set the lasagna in the fridge and said he didn't much like spinach, pretending to be something else. He seemed tired around the eyes, but he was himself, sinew and stubbornness and humor resting on the counter beside the knife block. They did come back bearing lilies and concern. Victor put a hand on Elliot's shoulder, as if steadying him for a photograph. Elaine assessed the cabin with the clinical gaze of someone about to recommend an expensive renovation. "Have you thought about long-term care, Elliot?" she asked, as if long-term were a chaise lounge you could simply add. "There are better options than this." She meant, among other things, me. Elliot thanked them in a tone that left the gratitude standing outside like a polite stranger. "Lena visits when she can," he said. "I have help when I need it." Elaine's eyes flicked to the painting above the hearth, one I had never signed. Victor's gaze paused at the map cabinet. They stayed an hour and left with promises to organize a schedule we had not requested. The weeks folded around appointments and routines. I learned the names of his medications by their shapes and colors, lined them in a shallow drawer like chess pieces I refused to let be cornered. I spoke with Ms. Klein about paperwork I didn't yet understand but could sign. Elliot let me carry the heavier of the grocery bags without pretending they weighed the same. He gave me the North Star ledger more often, along with a stack of envelopes to address in a hand steadier than his on that day. My parents began sending packages to my New York address, a scarf too bright for my taste, a coffee table book about interiors with chairs no one looked comfortable, in a note in Victor's orderly script about being proud of my work ethic. Elaine left me a phone message bursting with praise over a review of the student show she hadn't attended. Her voice had the speed of someone building momentum for an ask. I didn't return the call. On a Sunday in March, I took a bus home a day earlier than planned and saw their car in Elliot's driveway from the curve in the road. I let myself in quietly. Voices floated down the hallway, firm and persuasive. Elaine was saying something about signatures and streamlining decisions. Victor used the word fiduciary, as if the syllables themselves were credentials. I walked to the study doorway and leaned a shoulder against the frame. Elliot sat in his chair, hands folded, listening the way a tree listens to wind, giving a little, giving no more. Elaine straightened when she saw me. "Lena," she said brightly. "We were just discussing paperwork to make sure your grandfather is protected." Victor added, "You know how these things are." I said I do and did not sit. Elliot rose and asked me for a hand to the porch. On the boards, out of their line of sight, he squeezed my fingers once. "Dialogue is interesting," he said. "It tells you what people are afraid of." I said nothing. The lake burred softly against the shore. The next afternoon, they arrived again, this time with Caleb in tow. Larger through the shoulders, his old ease thinned into something tauter. We walked down to the dock because the cabin felt too small for the four of us and all the air they displaced. He sat with his sneakers just above the skin of the lake, hands clasped around one knee. "They're worried," he said after a while, as if this were a neutral fact like weather. I made a sound that could have been anything. He winced. "Dad's business is in a hole," he said. "They refinanced the house. Twice." He didn't look at me when he added, "They think you've been managing things." "Up here." The unspoken accusation hung between us like humidity. "Managing," I said. "I make lists and roast potatoes. Elliot makes decisions." Caleb turned the laces of his shoe into a knot and undid it without looking. "They told me you—" He broke off. We listened to the slap of water against wood. "I should have called you when you left," he said finally, and the sentence came out as one piece, not several. "You were a kid," I said. "It didn't cost me anything to let him off that hook, and I didn't do it as a favor." He nodded quick once. We sat a while longer and didn't pretend not to hear the murmur from the kitchen when our parents thought walls were stronger than they were. Elliot heard enough. That night, after the house fell quieter than sleep, I saw the light under the study door. He was at the desk with a yellow pad and the old checkbook writing in his small, neat hand, making a phone list for the morning. He looked up and tilted the chair back a habit that made the worn leather creak. "I'll handle it," he said, and there was no burden offered to me inside the sentence, only information. In the morning, he called Ms. Klein and his accountant. He spoke with the calm of a man who understands the terrain and has already measured the distance to the fence. Spring slid into summer. Treatments stacked up like saucers. Some days, Elliot moved slowly as if the air had thickened. Other days, he beat me to the truck. I took on more of the North Star work because not doing it felt worse. I vetted grant proposals at the kitchen table with a pencil behind my ear, carrying forward the pieces of his method that were simply the bones of attention, what was being asked for, who it reached, how to add without smothering. He liked to say that numbers could blush if you looked at them right. I began to see what he meant. On a Thursday evening in late September, the light lay thin and gold on the floorboards, pointing every scratch toward the same corner of the room. The kettle boiled hard and settled. Elliot was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from finishing a long thought. He stood with care, one palm on the table for balance, and tipped his head toward the hallway. "Come with me," he said. "There's something in the study I want to show you." We walked past the shelf with the tin of recipes, past the map cabinet, into the room that always smelled faintly of graphite and wood. He set his hand on the top drawer of the desk and waited a beat, as if acknowledging that names and papers have their own gravity. Then he drew the handle. The desk drawer slid open with a small wooden sigh of something well made. Elliot took out a cigar box bleached by years of sun and set it between us. Inside lay a brass key taped to an index card and a sealed envelope with my name in his narrow engineer's script. "That key," he said, tapping it with a knuckle, "belongs to a safe deposit box at Bay State Bank on Water Street. If I'm not the one to hand it over, you bring it to Mr. Alden Pike, my attorney. He'll know the rest." He sat as if the chair had earned it. "I haven't been poor in a long time, Lena," he said quietly. "I just prefer furniture that doesn't talk." He nodded toward the cabin, the mismatched chairs, the stubborn stove, the map cabinet, whose drawers sometimes stuck until you coaxed them with 2 fingers in patience. "How much?" The question left my mouth before I could dress it better. He considered. "Round numbers make people brave or foolish. Call it 20 million on paper, and a little less in the hand depending on the week." He watched my face for a flinch and found one. "Most of it works while we sleep. Some of it buys boots, bus fares, braces." "You already know that part." I looked at the ledger on the corner of the desk, the 2 handwritings braided through its columns like conversation. I knew the part he meant the entries that wore plain names and did their work quietly. "I've kept records," he said, touching the envelope with my name. "Dates, letters. Things your parents have said in rooms they mistook for empty. Nothing that isn't legal. Enough that if anyone wants to tell a story that doesn't fit the truth, the paper will tell it back. Mr. Pike has copies. Ms. Klein knows where to tug if a knot tightens." He didn't sound angry. If anything, he sounded like a man discussing weather fronts. He slid the envelope to me. "For when I'm not here to answer your questions with more questions," he said. "Don't open it yet. It's a last word, not a first one. We didn't talk about wills. We talked about dinner. We ate soup with too much time and laughed at the way the spice bit back. Later in the living room, he taught me once more how to tie a bowline without looking the rope, remembering faster than my fingers. After that night, time changed shape, not faster or slower exactly, but firmer at the edges, as if each day had decided to mean what it meant. The home health nurse Rosa began coming 3 mornings a week. Elliot pretended to dislike the attention, and then did whatever she asked. He let me carry the water jugs and the basket of laundry. He sat longer with his eyes closed after lunch, his breath moving in the same quiet meter as the lake. My phone buzzed with small kindnesses. Mara sending a photograph of a wire bird she swore had learned to balance on nothing, a professor's polite email about an extension I hadn't requested. It also buzzed with a new pattern voicemail from my mother, in a tone that made concern sound like a parlor trick. I didn't call back. On a raw day in late October, Elliot said he didn't want to go to the hospital again. "I won't negotiate with fluorescent light," he said, and Rosa, sensible, unsentimental, said that was fine, they could manage here. We moved a chair to the window so he could watch Stillwater breathe. The first ice came and went in a lace that never lived past noon. I learned which medication made him queasy and which one brought his humor back for an hour. I kept the house at a temperature he called stubborn. In the afternoons when he felt up to it, he asked me to read from the old logbooks he'd kept when the cabin was more working than resting the winter. The pipes burst and he learned how to solder. By failing twice this spring. The roof let go at the ridge and he traded labor with Mr. Bell from up the road. Elliot's hands in the bell tower for bells on the shingles. He listened with eyes closed, smiling at the parts that had stung at the time. One evening, the sky bruised purple before it agreed to darken, he asked me for the ledger. We sat side by side at the table. He pointed with his chin. "Tell me who you think needs a hand before the ground freezes," he said. I ran down the column, the Harbor House Furnace Fund. C. Ortiz, whose new job would turn solid if he could just get steel-toe boots that didn't chew his feet. M. Alvarez, whose tutoring hours had made math less like a wall. Elliot nodded and signed where I had put small squares. He slept more. The pauses between stories lengthened. Sometimes he woke unable to find the right word and solved the problem by showing me with his hands. When the pain grabbed too hard, he wrote it like weather and then swore softly at its back. I learned the tiny skills grief requires and hopes never to use, how to tip a cup to another person's mouth without rushing them, how to shave a jaw that had never let anyone else near it with a razor. Near the end of November, the doctor came up in a coat too thin for our hill and spoke to me in the kitchen with the stove ticking. He used the phrases people use to offer you a map for a place that refuses to be mapped. Rosa tucked more blankets around Elliot and called me Mija when I didn't move for a long moment, because if I moved, I would have to keep moving. The last clear afternoon arrived like a small grant, unexpected, sufficient, not meant to be hoarded. Elliot asked for the chair by the window and for the photograph of the lake in winter that I had framed from my student show because he liked the way the brush made quiet out of noisy things. He reached for my hand. "Don't carry more than you can put down again," he said, which sounded like a sentence about groceries and wasn't. He dozed. The light thinned. When his eyes opened again, he looked at the water a long time, the exact place where the reeds drew a trembling line, and then he set his breath down like a tool he had finished with and did not pick it up. I sat with him until the dark came up, and then a little longer, because leaving the room felt like naming things I hadn't agreed to name. Rosa closed his eyes with a touch as practiced as respect. The kettle hissed. The cabin altered itself by degrees. Even the clock seemed to keep a different kind of time. We kept it small the way he would have. The church in town filled with faces that placed themselves in my mind by what they said afterward, the woman whose bakery loan had begun with Elliot's quiet cashier's check, the retired nurse who'd found an envelope on her porch the year she thought she'd lose the house, the kid from 3 winters ago who had worn a trumpet case like a shield and now stood taller than the pew. They spoke to me as if I were a link in a chain that mattered because it held. Elaine and Victor arrived late, as if grand entrances impressed sorrow. The sedan shone a shade blacker than other black. My mother wore a dress with a zipper that announced itself. My father's watch face flashed every time he lifted his hand to rest it performatively on her shoulder. They moved down the aisle, touching people just enough to register. Caleb followed broader in a suit that argued with his shoulders. When he saw me, he gave a small nod that belonged to the kid who used to drift shots into the hoop long after the light had gone from the driveway. The service said what services say. I sat with my palms flat on my skirt and watched how sunlight touched dust in the high air. At the cemetery, the wind came sideways and the ground gave a little underboots. I laid a sketch on the cedar Elliot's hands, minus the scars, because I hadn't let myself paint them, and a single stem of something white. Across from me, Elaine dabbed nothing from her eye and adjusted the angle of a ribbon on a wreath, so the photographer from the local paper invited by, no one would have a clean line. Victor shook hands with the minister and let the minister see his watch. When the earth took him first softly in handfuls, then with a hollow sound that made everyone blink, I felt not relief, but a rightness that refused to apologize for being right. It did not make breathing easier, but it made it honest. People who had loved Elliot for reasons money can't guess came to stand with me for a minute and then moved away so the next person could stand. They left stories like stones on a low wall. The sky burned off its first try at snow and became simply gray. The minister closed his book. Shoes began to find paths toward cars. It should have ended there. It almost did. As we turned onto the lane that would take us back to town, I heard my mother's voice tilt under her breath, half-stage whisper, half-command. "When do we meet the lawyer?" she asked my father, not bothering to sand the edge from the word lawyer, as if anyone passing within reach of that syllable might mistake it for compassion. Victor murmured something that contained a day and a time. I didn't turn. I kept walking until the lane opened into the road, and the lake lay visible again between 2 pines, steady as a held note. The wind lifted a corner of my scarf and laid it back down. That evening, in the quiet of the cabin without the kettle's second voice, I set the brass key on the table and placed Elliot's sealed envelope beside it. The room smelled of wool and cedar, and the faintest trace of lilies that had tried and failed to colonize the air. I washed the single teacup and set it on the rack. Then I sat where he had liked to sit, where the glass turned the world into a rectangle. He could think inside and let the household sound the way it always had. 2 mornings after the burial, I walked up 3 flights to Alden Pike's office over the barber on Water Street. The waiting room smelled faintly of tonics and paper. A window looked down on the river, where it tightened to pass under the brick arch. Mr. Pike rose from behind a desk that had been polished by decades of sleeves and set a pitcher of water between us like a truce offering. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and for once the words did not feel rented. He set Elliot's envelope in front of me. "We'll read this after," he added. "The will first." He gathered the small group into the conference room. Rosa, with a cardigan neatly buttoned. Ms. Klein, the director from Harbor House, and a man from the bank. The door clicked again. Elaine entered on a tide of perfume and black wool. Victor, a pace behind, and Caleb, last the only one who met my eyes. They chose chairs with their backs to the window, as if daylight were an audience they preferred to face. Pike read the preamble dates, signatures, phrases that had to stand in for breath. He moved on to bequests measured in attention rather than value, the map cabinet to Mr. Bell, so he can keep finding his way, the first edition field guides to the town library, a check to the church for whichever roof is leaking next. Then his voice settled and the room did the same. As to the remainder of my estate, he read, including all real property accounts and interests. I give, devise, and bequeath to my granddaughter Lena Marlowe to hold and manage as she deems fit, with the understanding that she knows where the lever belongs. Elaine's mouth flattened as if the sentence were a sour candy. Victor leaned forward, steadying his hands on the table. "This is absurd," he said, before remembering where he was. "I am his son." Mr. Pike took off his glasses and polished them with a square of cloth that had been folded too carefully to be casual. "Mr. Reed's decisions were made over many years," he said. "He prepared for your surprise." He opened a folder thick with paper. "A notarized letter dated 3 summers ago describing the incident in which your daughter was told to leave your home with a backpack. Affidavits from neighbors from Riverside Arts Charter, from the Home Health Agency, from Harbor House." He set each document down in a careful stack. "Bank records indicating attempted access to Mr. Reed's accounts from a computer registered to your residence. Mr. Reed declined to press charges at the time. He did, however, make a note." Victor's face went the color of paper that has been erased too many times. Elaine kept her eyes on Pike's tie. "We were trying to help," she said. The sentence had no place to sit. "There is also—" Pike went on a statement from Mr. Reed's physician about capacity recorded at intervals and a short video Mr. Reed asked me to keep. He nodded to the man from the bank, who turned the laptop toward the room. Elliot appeared in soft light, the chair by the window behind him, the lake pulling one quiet breath. "If you're hearing this, it means I am where I meant to go," he said. "I have left my things with the person who already treated them as tools, not trophies. Thomas, I wish you well. Elaine. I hope you find the comfort you've been trying to buy. This is not a punishment, it is a match." He named the North Star Fund and the ledgers that would continue it. He listed people by first name, an initial enough for a path, not a spectacle, and ended as if he had merely closed a door to keep out a draft. When the screen went dark, the room held very still. Elaine drew in breath for a performance and found no stage. Victor's jaw worked once. "We'll contest," he said, but the sentence lacked blood. "You are free to hire counsel," Pike said. "I will respond with the documents you've seen, and a few you haven't. The result will be public." He did not say more. He didn't need to. Caleb cleared his throat. "Dad," he said not loudly. Victor glanced at him, then down at his hands. Elaine stood smoothed the front of her dress as if checking for lint, and walked out without looking back. Victor followed, one hand grazing the doorframe as if to steady himself on wood that had nothing to give him. Caleb lingered. "I'll call you," he said to me, and it landed as a promise, not a placeholder. The room exhaled. Rosa squeezed my shoulder in a way that acknowledged a weight without offering to take it. The Harbor House director nodded, eyes wet. Mr. Pike slid the safe deposit key across the table. Bay State Bank, he said. We'll go together. We went that afternoon. The vault smelled like nickels and cold. In the small booth, he laid the box on green felt. Inside were the expected things, documents, statements, a list in Elliot's tidy hand, and one unexpected, a fold of photographs bound with twine. Stillwater in every season. My hands tying a bowling out of focus. A card with 2 words, use well. I didn't sleep much, which is not to say I lay awake. I moved through the house like a person trying to remember where a familiar song begins. In the morning, I met with the accountant Pike trusted and learned that 20 million behaved like a river. You shaped its banks, or it shaped yours. The North Star ledger lay open on the table by evening. I wrote checks in amounts that made sense when you knew the names attached to them. I left the cabin as it was the dent in the coffee table, the chair by the stove that complained if you sat down too quickly, the hook by my desk where the Riverside letter still swung on breezes. News traveled the way it always does in towns like ours, faster than cars, slower than rumor. Elaine sent a single message through Caleb. You'll regret this. It sounded tired. She moved south before the snow set in to a development with water that had no mood and lawns that were the same length in every yard. Victor asked to meet. We chose a diner halfway to Providence. The coffee came in cups that remembered being white. He looked smaller, without a tie, older, without the confidence that had once filled him like starch. I didn't see the line I crossed, he said, and the sentence was not an apology, but it didn't run from one. I thought a good life was a picture you kept adjusting. He folded and unfolded the paper napkin. I can't fix it. I know, I said. The window showed a parking lot with one gull inspecting the painted arrows as if for meaning. He asked careful questions about the cabin, about whether I was safe, about whether I needed anything that money could buy and didn't already have. I told him I was fine. He nodded as if the word were a language he was only beginning to learn. When we parted, he didn't reach for a hug. He placed his palm on the table between us and left it there a second, then stood. Caleb called on Sundays. Sometimes he came up on his own the way you test ice in late winter, one careful step, then another. We sat on the dock and let the conversation find its level, his knee finally repaired. The job he'd taken that kept him in town, the way the cabin sounded at night when the wind dropped and even the pines went quiet. He carried out the recycling without asking. He never once asked the price of anything. I kept painting. The work changed not because the house was different, but because the light had moved and I was trying to catch where it had gone. I rented a small studio in town above a shop that sold kitchen spoons and secondhand glass. I hung 2 canvases in the window and sold one to a woman who said the color of the water looked like the inside of a bell. The North Star Fund continued to do what it had always done now, with receipts that had my signature in the corner. We added a line for art supplies in the ledger because Mara asked not for herself, but for the girl in her building who had built a city out of cardboard and needed a better knife. On the first spring thaw, I walked the ridge and read Elliot's letter at last. The paper had the faint scent of his desk drawer, graphite, and cedar. He had written about ordinary days, split wood, an engine that finally turned the pleasure of a clean table, and about the relief of leaving what he loved in hands that already held it. North Star, he wrote, was never a program. It's just a habit. Keep the habit. There wasn't more. There didn't need to be. When I came down, the lake was wearing that particular blue that means the ice has gone all the way to the bottom. I stood on the dock and watched a pair of loons cut a seam the water immediately forgot. In the cabin, the kettle began to push a thread of steam from its mouth. I went in, set 2 mugs on the table without thinking, and then put one back in the cupboard. The other I filled sat by the window and let the room be what it was. Boards light a chair, a ledger open to a half-finished page, a hook on the wall where a letter sometimes stirred when the air moved. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.